واتل ما أوحي إليك من كتاب ربك لا مبدل لكلماته ولن تجد من دونه ملتحدا.
الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We continue inshallah ta'ala with the tafsir of Surah Al-Kahf from the tafsir of Imam Al-Sa'di rahimahullah, and ayah number 28. Ayah number 28 from Surah Al-Kahf. يقول الله عز وجل: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. واصبر نفسك مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي يريدون وجهه ولا تعد عيناك عنهم تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا ولا تطع من أغفلنا قلبه عن ذكرنا واتبع هواه وكان أمره فرطا. Which means, and keep yourself patient by being with those who call upon their Lord in the morning and the evening, seeking His face, and let not your eyes pass beyond them, desiring adornments of the worldly life, and do not obey one whose heart we have made heedless of our remembrance, and who follows his desire, and whose affair is ever in neglect. So this ayah continuing the commands from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, after what's mentioned about the people of Al-Kahf, Ahlul Kahf, Ashabul Kahf, and because of the purpose of their mention is for the benefit that comes as a result of that from what happened to them, and also from the fact that the people of the book, when they had dispute among one another with regards to Ashabul Kahf, their number, their names, and all of these things, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is directing us to take a lesson from that and to be away from what is not benefiting, and to focus on what's the purpose of all of this. So continuing these commands, wasbir nafsak, and as mentioned yesterday, that even though the Prophet ﷺ is the one that is addressed by this initially, but it's for the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is the rule. This is the rule of all of these commands to the Prophet ﷺ, that it's for him and for the ummah, unless something else extra is mentioned to specify that this is exclusive only for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So here this ayah, واصبر نفسك مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي, and we'll inshallah ta'ala we need to connect them all together because the purpose of this is to act upon the Quran. And if we act upon what we hear and it becomes something that changes our life, then this is basically what the people of Ahlul Quran. So Ahlul Quran, they are the ones that act upon the Quran. So these are commands from Allah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who establish it in their life. So here Imam Sa'di rahimahullah, he says, in the bottom of page 929, يأمر تعالى نبيه محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم وغيره أسوته في الأوامر والنواهي. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ya'mur, He's commanding His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and other than the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he is the example for them. في الأوامر والنواهي, the commands and the nawahi and what's forbidden. So that part of the sentence here gives us an extra meaning here. Something that more than what we just heard. Meaning that al-khitab, the ayat addresses is to the Prophet ﷺ and to his ummah, unless there's specific evidence as we heard this. But specifically mention the Prophet ﷺ first, because he's the uswa, he's the example to be followed. So as if the ayah is saying for the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, if you want to apply this command, don't just read it and apply it. Look in the Prophet ﷺ how he applied it, because he's the example for you. So you cannot apply this ayah or these verses unless you follow the Prophet ﷺ, which is the case for every command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not just commands in the absolute sense. ليست أوامر مجردة, like this just command and everyone has their own ways of implementing it. No, لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر. وذكر الله كثيرا. Indeed, you have in the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam the best example. So when you put these two together, and the wisdom behind the command is being to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam first, is for the ummah to follow the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So what is it here? أن يصبر نفسه مع المؤمنين العباد المنيبين. That the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he was commanded to أن يصبر أو يصبر نفسه, to make himself patient with the believers, al-ubbad, those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-munibin, those who return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always with repentance and invocation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, mentioning their characteristics, so wasbir nafsak and nafsak. Wasbir nafsak. There's difference between saying wasbir, be patient, and wasbir nafsak, make yourself patient. So it gives the meaning that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be something that you would find yourself inclined to do. You have to make yourself patient. And as this is something that when we talked about it before, sometimes you have to make your nafs as if it's a separate entity, someone else that you are sometimes in war with, sometimes you're at peace with, but you have to be watchful of your own self, because it's going to get you if you leave it, if you don't wean it, because the nafs is inclined to be lazy, inclined to follow its desires. This is how we are as human beings. So you yourself has to make sure that you have to make sure that your nafs is upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from it. So you make yourself patient. You have to endure patience. It's going to be against your feelings, against what you like. So prepare yourself to be upon patience. Because the ibadah to Allah is not according to what you feel or what you like, even if you're the most righteous. If you're the very, mashallah, righteous and obedient to Allah, don't trust your feelings still, but rather follow the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And know, and that's the importance of knowledge, knowing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, and then do that even if it's against your feelings. Doesn't matter. Because we don't worship our feelings. We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's a very tricky one, but not with knowledge. With knowledge, it's not tricky. But if a person is left to his own self, and that's why there's a major difference between the ubbad and the ulama. The ubbad, those who worship Allah, they can be easily deceived by shaitan. It feels good. It looks good, has its great effect and benefit and all kinds of things. But is it with real knowledge or not? Is it according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ or not? If it's not, then put aside all of these feelings. The nafs ammara bisu, it can be commanding the person to do evil when it feels good, religiously also. So, and that's why the al-irtibat bil-wahy, to be so much attached to the wahy, to the revelation from Allah in every matter in our life. So, and wasbir nafsak. With who? مع الذين, with those who يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي. Those who يدعون, they invoke Allah, they make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بالغداة والعشي, in the morning and in the evening. He says أي أول النهار وآخره, beginning of the day and the end of the day. يريدون بذلك وجه الله. يريدون وجهه, they are seeking, they are wanting by this wajh Allah, the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we know, the believers, they will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment. Seeing the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is a fact, this is a matter of belief in the hereafter, and believing in the attributes of Allah, and also nothing wrong with saying, seeking the rewards from Allah, the blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of that is fine, and it's not altering the meaning, as long as a person believes in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals. So he says here, فَوَصَفَهُمْ بِالْعِبَادَةِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala characterized them with al-ibadah, with the worship, وَالْإِخْلَاص فِيهَا, and al-ikhlas, the sincerity, the purity of their intentions, because يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَ. They are making dua, they're making dhikr, they're making salah in the beginning of the day, the end of the day. So this is the ibadah, the action. And the ikhlas, yuriduna wajha. They don't seek anything but the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So he says here, فَفِيهَا الْأَمْرُ بِصُحْبَةِ الْأَخْيَارِ. In this ayah, الأمر, the command here, بصحبة الأخيار, to have the companionship of the good ones. ومجاهدة النفس على صحبتهم ومخالطتهم. And مجاهدة النفس, to struggle with oneself, to be upon that fact, to be in their companionship and to mix with them. So الأمر, and not just do it, no, prepare yourself. It's not going to be something that you would like initially. You have to force yourself. They're not the same type as yours. They're not in the same level as you. They might be poorer. They might be from a different environment, different culture, different whatever there is that makes people not acquainted with one another. Then that means you have to go against yourself. If you look at the suhbah, and we can mention many things here, but it's required for us, and this is for each and every one of us to do this. Look at the suhbah, look at the companionship, that how human beings, they get together and who's their companions and who their friends and so on. You would find most of the time it's because they have some common things between them. Why? Well, they have this companionship because of things that are common. They like each other, certain traits, things like this. And most of it, it's for matters of dunya. Rarely you would find someone super rich, his closest friend is the poorest person on the face of earth. I'm not sure if this is something that can exist. It might be nice to them, this and that, if they're nice people, but they're not their friends. They're friends, they're companions. They're with them all the time. The same thing, someone is very smart versus someone, whatever. So you won't find the two opposites being companions. But when you look at the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, the matter was different. And that's where the also sabab al-nuzul that was revealed. But you would see that what brought them together more than anything else is these characteristics, because they were followers of the wahy. Not just because they became believers, so it just made sense that they're all together. This is not deen. The deen is they were so attached to the wahy. And they made a decision before they would trust their feelings. Right? The wahy says, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. So this is a decision made. And they will be steadfast upon this. Then the feelings and the inclination and all of these things comes later. But it's not the thing that drives them. It's the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why it requires that this is a command from Allah and mujahadatun nafs. That means you have to force yourself. You have to take the means to be with them. وَمُجَاهَدَةُ النَّفْسِ عَلَى صُحْبَتِهِمْ وَمُخَالَطَتِهِمْ. So even in your suhbah, even in your friends, this is deen. It is not left to yourself. فإن في صحبة وإن كانوا فقراء. He says even if they were فقراء, if they were poor, it doesn't matter. If they fit these characteristics. فإن في صحبتهم من الفوائد ما لا يحصى. And since this is the command of Allah, therefore the fawaid, the benefits in their suhbah, في صحبتهم, in their suhbah, in their companionship, benefits ما لا يحصى, you cannot even count them. So many of these benefits. You can try to figure out some of it, but since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered, that means that's it. That means the benefits are something that even nobody can comprehend how much is it. So this is the command. وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُ. After giving that command to also make sure that it's perfected, do not extend your eyes away from them. وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ. أي لا تجاوزهم بصرك. Do not make your eyes go beyond them. وَتَرْفَعْ عَنْهُمْ نَظَرَكَ. And you do not make your nazar, your looking, to be away from them or above them. That means you focus on them. So to be with them, but don't make sure that you don't allow yourself to look beyond them to other individuals or other people, because this can corrupt your heart. And it would weakens your sabr, your patience, and weakens your mujahada, and it makes you lose this command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by not applying it. So وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ. So this is to stay with them. And since الصبر is حبس النفس على ما تكره, that's the definition of sabr. It's okay if we're spending some time here, but we'll finish inshallah ta'ala in 15 minutes inshallah. So الصبر, what's the definition of الصبر? حبس النفس على ما تكره. حبس, you imprison yourself for something that it doesn't like. That's what sabr is. That's originally what sabr is. So, and since this is the command to be patient, that means you have to imprison yourself upon this. When someone is in prison, physically, he does not look beyond the prison. He's in there, in that room, in these four walls. So that means the companionship of the righteous ones, it's not a pleasant word to say imprison yourself, but that means give up from your own self in looking beyond them. And this shows the importance of that strength within oneself. A person has to make some decisions, and one of the easiest ways to do good is to give up on other alternatives. Giving up on things makes things easy for the person, not the opposite. And as mentioned before, if someone is poor, he's given up on owning an airplane. So he's not struggling with his own self, suffering, oh, I don't have an airplane. He does not think about it. But someone close to having it, he might be suffering with his own self. I wish I have an airplane. Because he's almost there, but he doesn't have the means. So who's more happier? The one that far away from it. That's something that even some of the early generations of Islam talked about these meanings. They become the most rich when they are in no need of it. When you're not in need of something, you're rich when it comes to that thing. So whether you already have so many, so you don't need what is less, or you choose that you don't need this, so you're not inclined towards it, so you're not suffering as a result of not having it. And this is a way to overlook the things that makes people miserable in this life. So wasbir nafsak, gives this meaning, and to stay in such a state. ولا تعد عيناك عنهم, as we heard. So ولا تعد عيناك عنهم, do not as we heard, that you do not extend, you don't take yourself to another level even with your own eyes. And that means that غض البصر, to lower your gaze when it's sometimes other individuals, do not look at them too much, do not listen to them too much, because it can corrupt your heart, especially if disbelievers and things like this. And that's why it's an advice for those who watch those who are so rich and so living a lavish life and so on. It corrupts the heart when you keep on thinking, what's the benefit of it? There's no benefit anyway. You take the means, do the best you can, mashallah. There's nothing wrong with being the richest man on the face. There's nothing wrong with this. But when watching and listening and talking about this matter, it doesn't make the person feel good, but rather focusing on matters that is benefiting for oneself. تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا. So ولا تعد عيناك عنهم. تريد, that you want زينة الحياة الدنيا, the adornment of this worldly life. So don't want the adornment. The zina, as we talked about, the zina is mentioned in the beginning of the surah, is the outside layer that is of no function. There's no functionality to it. It's just the layer from the outside. But does it have a practical meaning to it? No, it's just the way that pleases the eyes. Zina, adornment. So do not go after the adornment of this life. He says, فَإِنَّ هَذَا ضَرٌّ غَيْرُ نَافِعٍ, because this is harmful, it's not benefiting. قاطع عن المصالح الدينية. It severs, it cuts you away from the religious benefits. Why? فإن ذلك يوجب تعلق القلب بالدنيا. Because that makes يوجب, like necessity, brings it not as an obligation, but means it makes it then upon the heart to be attached to the dunya. And the heart, when it's attached and hanging to the dunya, this is the foundation for all diseases of the heart. فإن ذلك يوجب تعلق القلب بالدنيا فتصير الأفكار والهواجس فيها. So then it becomes the afkar, your thoughts, al-hawajis, your whims. Al-hajis is when something just flies by like this. So the whim, all of that becomes engaged in the dunya, because the heart is attached to it. And whatever in the heart, then it comes into one's thoughts, one's whims. So the heart is always busy with matters of dunya. وَتَزُولُ مِنَ الْقَلْبِ الرَّغْبَةُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. And the heart would not have the place for both. Tazul is removed from the heart, الرغبة, the zeal in the hereafter. Because one pushes the other. They both cannot be in the same place. So that's why when people say, but what's wrong with wanting the dunya and the hereafter? Wanting, no. In the absolute sense. You can be again, as we said, you're the wealthiest, you're the healthiest, you have a comfortable life. All of that we don't make what's halal haram. As long as it's halal, there's nothing wrong with it. But the heart should not have any place in it except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, which is seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The concern is the concern of the hereafter, without, of course, undermining the pleasure of this life. But also the pleasure of this life is for the sake of the hereafter, not to be wasted. So, because the heart does not have the place for both. He says, فَإِنَّ زِينَةَ الدُّنْيَا تَرُوقُ لِلنَّاظِرِ. And this is part of the test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The adornment of this dunya, and with ilm again, so that no one you would say you're saying to stay away from the dunya when everybody's attached to dunya. This is very obvious what is meant by this. Right? It's all about the heart being seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. فَإِنَّ زِينَةَ الدُّنْيَا تَرُوقُ لِلنَّاظِرِ. The adornment of the dunya, not the reality of this life. The adornment of it, taruq, that means becomes pleasing to another, to the one that looks at it. وتسحر القلب, and it makes the heart with sihr, and not the physical sihr, but what the sihr does make the person not aware of things. So makes the heart not aware of what's benefiting for it. فيغفل, as a result of that, then فيغفل القلب عن ذكر الله. The qalb become in forgetfulness from the dhikr, from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that was mentioned in the previous verses. ويقبل على اللذات والشهوات, and then it leads the person to come forward, to go forward to the desires and the lustful desires and the sinful things and wasting one's life. فيضيع وقته. So his time will be wasted, which is by itself is a great waste. Nobody wastes their money, but their if they waste their time, they have no problem with it. Time is more precious than even money, because that's what our assets in the hereafter is, the time that we live in. وَيَنْفَرِطُ أَمْرُهُ, and his affairs will be loose. Al-infirat is when you have a bracelet from pearls, for example, and you cut it, they all fall. So the matter is the affairs of the person becomes loose. He's not knowing what is benefiting and what's not. فيخسر الخسارة الأبدية, then he is in the everlasting loss. فيخسر loss الخسارة الأبدية. والندامة السرمدية, الندامة the regret, السرمدية سرمدا, that means also the everlasting one. ولهذا قال, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ولا تطع من أغفلنا قلبه عن ذكرنا, and do not obey the one that we أغفلنا قلبه, that we made his heart in forgetfulness from our dhikr, from our remembrance. غفل عن الله فعاقبه بأن أغفله عن ذكره. This is a punishment. غفل عن الله, he was forgetful away from Allah, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished him that he made him in ghafla from the dhikr of Allah. So the dhikr of Allah is a reward and also an action for a person to strive to attain. So it's tawfiq from Allah. If someone is given the dhikr of Allah, this is a gift from Allah as a result of what the person is in his heart with the dhikr of Allah and the remembrance of Allah. وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. Do not obey those who their hearts are in forgetfulness from the dhikr of Allah. وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ, and he followed his desire. Because if someone says, how would I know that someone's heart is in forgetfulness from the dhikr? When only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the hearts. As mentioned before, if physical actions are bad, that means we already know what's in the hearts. You cannot be saying if someone is doing evil, that means his heart is good. There's no such a thing. You might mean by good, that means he's good towards people. That's fine. But his heart has a disease in it. If he does not make salah, his heart is good towards people, this is to himself for matters of dunya. But does he have diseases in his heart? His heart is corrupted, yes. So this is how وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ. So this is how a person, now the command is to be away from those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in these negative characteristics, and also not to obey those who shows these characteristics. So وَلَا تُطِعْ, do not obey. مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ, and he followed his desires. أي صَارَ تَبَعًا لِهَوَاهُ. His desires, he follows his desires, whatever his desires takes him. حيث ما اشتهت نفسه فعله. Every time his nafs, his own self, desires something, he would do this. وسعى في إدراكه, and he would take the diligent means to attain it. ولو كان فيه هلاكه, even if it has in his own destruction, وخسرانه, and his loss. فهو قد اتخذ إلهه وهواه He took his ilah as his desire as his ilah. كما قال تعالى أفرأيت من اتخذ إلهه هواه وأضله الله على علم الآية. Did you see the one that took his God as his desire? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deviated him based on knowledge. And this is the knowledge of Allah or the knowledge of the person. And then he says, وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا. And also to show the characteristics of those you do not obey. وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ meaning أي مصالح دينه وَدُنْيا. أمره his affairs, meaning the benefits, the matters of benefits of his deen and his dunya. Worldly, religious matters and worldly matters. فُرُطًا. فُرُطًا أي ضائعة. الفرط again is something loose, not something that is tight. That means ضائعة معطلة, lost, not doing any of its jobs. فهذا قد نهى الله عن طاعته. Type of a person like that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade the believers from obeying him. لأن طاعته تدعو إلى الاقتداء به. Because obeying him would invites the person to follow him, to follow his example. ولأنه لا يدعو إلا لما هو متصف به. And because he would not call people to anything except what he is having in himself. Everyone calls people to what he likes, to what his attributes are, what his characteristics are. So that means if he's corrupted, he will call people to corruption, most likely. So as a result of that, ودلت الآية, the ayah is an evidence على أن الذي ينبغي أن يطاع, that the one that should be obeyed, ويكون إماما للناس, to be a leader for the people, من امتلأ قلبه بمحبة الله, the one that his heart is full of the love of Allah. وفاض ذلك على لسانه, and that flooded onto his tongue, because that's what happens. The heart, when it's filled with the love of Allah, with the fear of Allah, with the hope for the rewards from Allah, with the remembrance of Allah, then the tongue is the outside, is the spokes organ of the heart. So it becomes flooded with the dhikr of Allah. فَلَهَجَ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. اللهج بذكر الله, that means lots of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his breath. وَاتَّبَعَ مَرَاضِي رَبَّهُ, and he followed the things that pleases his Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَقَدَّمَهَا عَلَى هَوَاهِ, so he put it forward before his desire. فحفظ بذلك ما حفظ من وقته. So as a result of that, if someone is like this, he guarded what he guards from his time. وصلحت أحواله, and his affairs will be upright. واستقامت أفعاله, and his أفعال and actions become steadfast on the straight path. ودعا الناس إلى ما من الله به عليه, and he calls the people to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon him. فحقيق بذلك أن يتبع. That means حقيق, حق, this is the one that ought to be followed. ويجعل إماما, and for that person to be the imam is the one to be followed. He says والصبر المذكور في هذه الآية. What is the sabr in this ayah? واصبر نفسك. هو الصبر على طاعة الله, is to be patient, being obedient to Allah. الذي هو أعلى أنواع الصبر. This is the highest level of a sabr. وبتمامه يتم باقي الأقسام, and by completing it, the rest of the types of patience becomes complete, because the patience, الصبر على طاعة الله, الصبر عن معصية الله, الصبر على أقدار الله. To be patient to do the acts of obedience, to be patient to be away from sins, to be patient with the qadar of Allah, masa'ib, calamities, things in life. The highest of all is to be obedient, to be patient in obedience of Allah. So when a person is like this, then the rest falls in place, becomes easy for the person to attain. Also, وفي الآية استحباب الذكر والدعاء والعبادة طرفي النهار. The ayah also shows the recommendation here, the istihbab for a dhikr, remembrance of Allah, a dua, and the ibadah in the two ends of the day. And the two ends of the day, from adhan of Fajr, you have all the way to sunrise and afterwards. And the end of the day starts from Asr, adhan all the way to after Maghrib. And the more that is closer to the end of the day, the more it's virtue. So from after Fajr, of course, and before sunrise, and the same thing, but in the beginning time of Fajr and in the beginning time of Maghrib and after Maghrib. He says, لأن الله مدحهم بفعله, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised them by their actions. وكل فعل مدح الله فاعله. Now this is a principle. Every action, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised its doer. كل فعل, every action. مدح الله, Allah praised فاعله, its doer. دل ذلك على أن الله يحبه. This is a clear evidence that Allah loves this action. وإذا كان يحبه, and if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves an action, فإنه يأمر به ويرغب فيه. Then He commands the people to do it and make them encouraged to do it. So all of the awamir of Allah, these are what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves for the people to do. So when a person fulfill the commands of Allah, he is upon the path of seeking the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the highest level that anyone can seek. And therefore, those who claim that they love Allah or they're seeking the love of Allah, but they don't follow the Prophet ﷺ, they don't follow strictly what's in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, they're just making a claim, which is the easiest thing in the world. How much a person is attached to the wahy, this is not, this is not a claim also. The claim is one thing. Is a person attached to the wahy or not? You cannot claim that. Right? There has to be actions to show whether a person is attached to the wahy or not. So it's easy to say, it's easy to claim, but how much a person is attached to the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ayat, or this ayah, requires, for us to learn more of it, and because of the time we'll stop here. There's sabab nuzul, there's reason why the verse is revealed, and most of the time in the tafsir does not mention that, but it gives an insight to the meanings of the verses, and it shows the lives of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. But we'll talk about that inshallah ta'ala, inshallah tomorrow, with also some of the meanings. And for us to study the Quran as a homework, and without, you don't have to submit anything. It was just to have to, this is part of the ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we go through from the beginning of the surah, or right after, from the beginning of what's mentioned about Ashab al-Kahf, and right after that, look at the af'al al-amr, look at the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is an actions that we are supposed to follow, and following the way the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So we'll continue with that inshallah ta'ala tomorrow. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم ربنا وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.